the focus of the study was Deep River, and in this figure here, with the yellow highlighted portion of Deep River, was what we consider the study reach. So you can see that at the upstream end, the limit of the study was at the confluence with Turkey Creek, and then at the downstream end, the limit was at the confluence with the Little Cal, where it then becomes Burns Waterway. So I think everyone here is well aware of the flood of September 2008. Of course, a lot of buildings in the study reach were inundated and significantly damaged. And when you look at the gauge values for that event, the discharge was just less than 5,300 CFS here at the gauge, just downstream of the dam. And that falls somewhere between the 100-year and 500-year events. So definitely a significant event. And partially because of the significance of the event, the magnitude of it, and also partially because of how recent it was, we decided to use the September 2008 event as a basis for a lot of the alternatives we evaluated. So what you'll be hearing is, for this potential solution, if this had been in place during the September 2008 event, we could have seen water level reductions of 2 feet, 3 feet, whatever. So we use the September 2008 event as the basis here. And if we look at the gauge data, again, this USGS gauge is located on Deep River, just a little ways downstream of the dam here in Hobart. You look at, I've got the gauge data shown with the blue, and then I also have some of the statistical flood events. So the green line is showing the 10-year, yellow is 50, 100-year and 500-year are also shown on there. So you do see the significance of that September 2008 event again, somewhere between the 100 and 500-year events. But if we take a closer look at the most recent data that's shown on the plot here, that is as of yesterday, data collected off of the gauge. You can see if you drove over Old Ridge Road, you saw the flow going over the dam, and you're all aware, a significant rainfall and whatnot. And if you look at, and this is thanks to Bob and Phil here, but if you do a comparison of the discharges on Deep River to Hart Ditch and Little Cal, so Deep River is the red line. We got a peak discharge for just yesterday of, it's about 1,700 CFS. But the peak discharge on Hart Ditch was somewhere around 800 or 900. And for the Little Cal, it was less than 500 CFS. So just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the flows that are coming through here in comparison to some of the other streams in the system. And these are photos that were taken just yesterday or the day before yesterday, taken just along the lake here. You can see how, there certainly was some flooding. And then one photo upstream a little ways on Wisconsin Street. We'll talk more about Wisconsin Street later on, but kind of, try to take a mental snapshot of how close the water is there to the bottom of the bridge. And if you look back at the USGS gauge data again, and we kind of shift gears back to the September 2008 event, I'll share with you some of the photos from that, so that you get an idea of the magnitude of the flooding right here that was occurring in September 2008. So we've got the wastewater treatment plant just a little ways downstream. And then this photo was taken a couple blocks away. Okay. So obviously as I mentioned, there is a need to better understand what's going on Deep River, and in order to do that, the first thing we did was collected several previous studies. We don't want to be duplicating any effort and want to make use of previous studies, of course. And we also collected several hydraulic and hydrologic models that had been prepared by the DNR and the Corps of Engineers and the MWRD, and also FEMA. And I'm going to kind of just go through some of the key points of those previously established hydraulic models. I think our goal going into this was that we could make use of one of these previously created models and just modify it, update it, and work from it. The DNR's model is considered the effective model for the reach, and generally speaking, it has not been updated in quite some time. So when you look at the cross sections of the stream that are used to define the system, they appear to be based off of some approximate contours.
From when?
The 70s.
70s?
Yep. Yep.
Because nothing's different now, right? Okay, sorry.
It's actually fairly common that a lot of the flood studies came out in the 70s and or 80s, yep, and using what is now considered old models, old methodologies, and of course old data as well.
What would trigger a DNR study like that?
Well, the effective model was created when the first flood insurance study was prepared.
So flood insurance requirements through FEMA.
Right.
And there's no requirements for that to be updated when asphalt goes down or buildings go up or no?
If you are working on a project within the stream, constructing a new bridge, that sort of thing, you can update it. You can, but you don't necessarily, there are certain things you do have to update and certain things you don't. But I mean, generally, yes, this was created decades ago, had not been updated since then. Another thing is that because it was created in an older model, there are limitations to the way things could be modeled. And the Lake George Dam here, clearly a dam, was actually modeled as a bridge. And the Lake Station Dam, which is a little ways downstream, was entirely excluded from the model. But again, this is the effective model for the reach. We also obtained a hydraulic model from the Corps of Engineers. This model had really similar cross-section geometry to what the DNR model, so again, very approximate. But there were some really good things that could be taken out of this. The first thing is that it included the interaction with Little Cal. The DNR's model doesn't. It isolates Deep River. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too.
What's that data from, Rachel?
I mean, Rick's been working on it. But the cross-section geometry, some of it could be, yes, because I think it was originally could have been developed from the model that the DNR is working from. But the Corps of Engineers model is a comprehensive model of the entire Little Cal Basin. So that's one of the strong points of it, is that it does, like I said, includes the interaction with Little Cal, which is something to consider on Deep River.
If I could add, I believe that was all flown in the 90s. And I don't know how much of it was updated in the model, but a lot of the design work for the federal system was done off aerial topography flown in 1990.
Thank you.
So the last hydraulic model that was obtained was from FEMA, and actually FEMA's contractor, and it was pretty much the same thing as the DNR's model, which is to be expected. And actually the FEMA's model seemed to be less up to date. There were some changes made to the bridges in the DNR's model that didn't show up in FEMA's model. So we also then collected some hydrologic models, which are useful for modeling the September 2008 event and some other historic events. But I think you're gathering what I'm getting at, and that is there are a lot of discrepancies with the models that had already been created, and the data was old. There were old methodologies being used, etc. So we decided that rather than trying to work from one of the previously created models, it would be better to take a fresh start. So with the hydraulic model, there's two main components. The first one is what we call the geometry. Basically, you need to define the stream, hydraulic structures, things that impact the flow. And in order to define the channel and the overbank areas, we start out with LiDAR data. But as some of you might know, LiDAR data doesn't penetrate below the water surface. And that's important. We're trying to model the stream. So we actually sent a survey crew out, and they did a comprehensive bathymetric survey of not just portions of Lake Georgia that are shown here, but the entire study beach. So now we've got the LiDAR data to cover the overbank areas and the bathymetric data to cover the in-channel areas. Those two data sets were tied together so that we had one comprehensive surface to work from. As I mentioned, some of the data that was used in the previously created models was approximate, I think. And so what I'm showing here is the top shows some of our field notes from the survey data that was collected. The middle schematic shows how that bridge, this particular bridge is the railroad bridge that's just downstream of Old Bridge Road here. The middle figure shows how it was modeled in some of the previous models. And then I just wanted to show you, the improvements that were made by conducting the survey data. Because when we create a more accurate representation of the bridges and the dams and whatnot, we are more accurately estimating the losses associated with each of those bridges, and we're creating a more accurate model overall. So this is kind of a busy map here, but basically just wanted to show the cross sections, the red, that were cut to define the channel and the overbank areas. I also wanted to note that, I've got the study reach shown in yellow here, but we actually needed to extend the model downstream on Burns Waterway a short distance, and also upstream on Deep River a short distance in order to evaluate all of the alternatives. So this model that we created included 16 miles of Deep River and then also Burns Waterway. And to define the channel, we cut 126 cross sections, and there were 24 bridges, which were, those within the study reach were surveyed in detail. And of course, we've also got the two dams within the study reach that were included in the model. And we created both a steady state and an unsteady state model. And basically, the steady state model is what's required for regulatory purposes, and what that is just a snapshot. You take your peak discharge and what does that profile look like. But the unsteady model allows us to route a hydrograph, an actual event through, and we can look at the impacts of loss of storage or addition of storage and how that could be beneficial. But because MWRD had some comprehensive hydrologic models already created, we did not repeat any of those efforts. So we did not develop any new hydrology as part of this. Something I want to note is that we used the LiDAR data and the bathymetric data and whatnot, and we used software that enabled us to create a georeferenced model. And basically, that helps us on the backside because we can automate the floodplain mapping. And I'll be showing you some figures of, this area would have been inundated based on our modeling results. Well, that was possible and because the model was georeferenced. And being able to develop those inundation maps, it can be a useful outreach tool also. So the September 2008 event was, of course, a significant event, but we look at the peak discharge being 5,300 CFS, and the peak stage being over about 22 feet or so at the gauge here. And what I want to point out on this hydrograph is that the river here went from a stage of about 5 feet to 22 feet in a matter of days, 2 days or so. So I would consider that to be a pretty flashy system. And that's something to keep in mind.
Inches of rain, wasn't it?
It was significant, yes. Sometimes we see systems where you might get an extreme rainfall event like that, but it takes weeks or longer for the hydrograph to peak. So this is something I'll kind of circle back around on when we talk about some of the alternatives too. So one thing that occurred during the September 2008 event that ended up actually benefiting us when we were looking at this model is that the USGS went out and collected data on the high water marks. And so they went out and surveyed all these high water marks. There were 28 of them within our study reach. And they categorized them based on the accuracy of the survey. And 27 of them had good ratings, which is within 0.05 of a foot. And then the last one was a fair one within 1/10 of a foot. So pretty good survey data. It's, I'd say, not all that common that when we're developing a hydraulic model, we have this quality of data to use for calibration. So I'm not going to bore you with the numbers and the statistics we use to measure our calibration, but if you just look at the bottom of this here, the value we use to check how close we are on our model results was around 29 when we did not do any calibration, and we usually try to get that as low as possible, around 2, 3 or so, but we were able to actually bring that to below 1 through the calibration. So now we've got a new model of Deep River, and we can use that to look at the 100-year event. Yes, we use the September 2008 event to evaluate a lot of alternatives, but let's take a second and see with that model, if we run FEMA's 100-year discharge, where are we at? How does it compare to the published base flood elevations in the flood insurance study? And you can see in this table here that actually the calibrated model gives high water levels that are higher than what's in the flood insurance study. So that translates to risks that may not be well communicated to property owners. Looking at the numbers is one thing. I think the better question to ask is, well, how does that impact people? How many people would be impacted by that? So I pulled together, an inundation map. So here's the benefit of having that georeference model. And apologize because it is hard to see on the screens, but you can see up here I've got like a blue hatch, and that continues up here. That is FEMA's special flood hazard area. That's their 100-year inundation area.
That's what's going to flood in the 100-year event.
According to FEMA. Yep, so that's...
FEMA's the one that makes everybody pay flood insurance.
Right.
So that has the impact on everybody sitting here that lives
Yep.
in this marsh.
Yep.
So how old's that data? Does it change like the other data?
It has not been updated. They've gone to...
Since when?
The elevations have not changed since the 70s. Right. Right. So, wanted to know how does the inundation area based on our modeling results compare to what FEMA thinks would be inundated during an event. And generally speaking, although we had that increase shown in that table of 1 or 2 feet throughout much of the study reach, those increases were generally in areas where the floodplain is fairly narrow. So there weren't necessarily properties added to the floodplain. But something that was noticed was that in this area of Lake Station here, first I want to say that the calibrated model results match FEMA's model. So we're not saying that the high water level should be higher. We're not saying that the 100-year floodplain elevation should be higher than what FEMA has. But if you just take that elevation and compare it to the LiDAR data, the yellow unhatched area over here should really be within the mapped floodplain. Those elevations, the elevation of the ground in this area, elevation of the ground in this area is below the effective base flood elevation. But for some reason, the area is not mapped in the 100-year floodplain. And I did talk to our contact at the DNR about this, and all he could say was it seems to be an inadvertent, error. Right. The risk, if property owners in this area were to look at FEMA's map, they would be under the impression that they're above the 100-year floodplain. But that's...
I'm all about making sure that doesn't happen.
Yep.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, on that note, if in order to update the maps, you need to prepare a letter of map revision, then to include that area and submit that to FEMA. All right, so enough about the model development. Now that we've got this model and it's calibrated, we're ready to look at some of the alternatives, with the goal in mind, of course, being to reduce the flooding. Here's the list. I'm going to start out with the levee construction, and we're revisiting the area of Lake Station now. So what I'm showing on this figure, there are blue dots and orange dots, and the blue and orange together identify structures that were in place during the September 2008 flood. And the yellow shading shows the limits of the flooding based on our model results for the September 2008 event. So we're talking about 230 structures that would have been inundated during that event.
They were or were not?
Based on our modeling results, they were. You can see the orange dots identify structures that have been removed since then. So about 40 structures have been, but nearly 200 structures still remain in that area. So because of that, this area really stood out as being maybe the area that would benefit most from construction of a levee. Highest potential to protect the most number of properties. And I'm showing in the bright yellow here, this is the alignment of the levee that we assumed. So what we're showing is the unhatched areas back here could potentially be protected if such a levee was constructed. Normally, when you construct a levee, you're taking storage out of the system, flood storage out of the system. So you might anticipate seeing some high water level increases due to that. But that area is extremely flat, and the storage that was removed was only about 1% of the total volume. And then, so because of that, we didn't see any increases. But the other factor that led to no increases in the base flood elevation was the fact that there are some significant tailwater conditions for Burns Waterway and the Little Cal and that whole confluence. So when you look at some of the profiles of Deep River down there, it's flat for quite a distance. So those two things together led to a modeling result that showed that you could construct that levee and you wouldn't cause any increases in the base flood elevations. But now what that means is that compensatory storage would not necessarily be needed. If such a levee was accredited, it would mean lower insurance rates for properties behind it, and it also removed the mandatory insurance purchase requirement. There would be some properties that would need to be acquired in order to construct it. There's about 20 of them. And there are limited drainage infrastructure components in place right now, so you definitely would need to construct some of that, pump stations, storm sewer leading to pump station, that sort of thing, yes. Moving along to the next alternative that was looked at, something that really stood out when we were developing the model was the fact that there are several bridges that are creating restrictions which lead to higher water surface elevations upstream. And an example of that would be the Chicago-Fort Wayne and Eastern Railroad Bridge, which is just downstream here. And when you look at the hydraulic profile, so this is a snapshot of some of the modeling results, and this was for the September 2008 event. You look at the water surface going up by 3.5 feet across that bridge. And we look at that as, if that bridge were reconstructed to effectively eliminate that restriction, that means that the water surface elevation upstream could potentially be 3.5 feet lower. 3.5 feet is significant, okay? And guess what's upstream? Downtown Hobart. So, that was the kind of thing that we looked at for the 4 most restrictive bridges. So the first most, of course, is that CF&E Railroad Bridge. The next one is 3rd Street. And then the railroad bridge just upstream of 3rd Street, right here. And also the Rand Street Bridge. So those 4 bridges created the most significant restrictions. And just taking a look at those in plan views in perspective. So we're, let's see, right down here. Yeah. Okay. So we looked at those bridges individually to say, if this one was improved, what would the benefits be, etc. But we also looked at those 4 together to say if all 4 of them were improved to effectively eliminate the restriction, how much lower would the water surface elevation have been during the September 2008 event for this area? And created some inundation maps based on that. And you can see that, the flood inundation area is certainly reduced. Again, actually, when you take out all 4 of the restrictions, you see a drop in water surface elevation of nearly 4 feet for this area, and tapers off to about 2 feet, 2.5 feet for other portions of Lake George. If we take a closer look at that Chicago-Fort Wayne and Eastern Railroad Bridge, some of the things we considered there were, what if the bridge was entirely removed? So then you're talking about the case of lowering the water surface elevations upstream by 3.5 feet for the September 2008 event. And in order to do that, in order to eliminate the restriction, you need to provide an opening of about 70 feet. But we would recommend that you actually bring it back to the full bank width to prevent erosion and whatnot. And that would be 110 feet.
Is this an active bridge?
It is.
What's the existing?
Right.
Actually, this one.
It's
This
the
cross section, she showed that's for
right. So what I'm showing here is kind of a before and after of the existing conditions for the railroad bridge and the opening, and at the same scale, what a 70-foot long bridge would look like. And just a note on this, that it was intentional that the west abutment was kept in about the same location, and the east abutment pushed further east because of anticipated conflicts with brickyard waste that would be buried and would be an issue for constructing a new abutment on the west side much further beyond the existing abutment. And then if we move a little bit further upstream to talk about 3rd Street, when you looked at that profile of the September 2008 event, you can see that 3rd Street had a head differential of about 1.8 feet. So that means that the water surface elevation upstream of 3rd Street, so in other words, for the majority of Lake George, was about 1.8 feet higher than it was downstream. And one of the other crossings that is upstream is Wisconsin Street. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But just looking at 3rd Street, the existing crossing has a current boulder clearance of about 4.5 feet. And for the 100-year event, based on the flood insurance study, there's about 1.1 feet of water depth over the road. So of course it needs to be closed. And for the September 2008 event, looking at just slightly more water on the road. This is a photo from the September 2008 event. So the modeling results were pretty close there. I also want to just point out some of the debris that is accumulated on the bridge. We'll touch on that too. So if 3rd Street were reconstructed to effectively eliminate the restriction, it would mean lower water surface elevations for the much of Lake George. And in order to eliminate the restriction, we looked at a case where the bridge was raised, but also lengthened. And it would take nearly twice the length of the bridge to eliminate the restriction. So that's pretty significant. The new headwater elevation would of course then be lower, and the road elevation would be set to be at least a foot above the headwater elevation. That's an INDOT requirement for roads in this category. So if we move a little further upstream and look at Wisconsin Street. So Wisconsin Street's located right here. Again, we're sitting over here. As I mentioned, 3rd Street has a direct impact on Wisconsin Street. And Wisconsin Street is a critical route to the hospital, which is located down here. And it's frequently closed because of overtopping. And just to throw some numbers at you, you can see the water depths for some of these statistical events. For the September 2008 event, there's approximately 6.5 feet of water depth over the lowest point of the road on Wisconsin Street. And this is just a schematic from the model, which again shows the depth of the water. So when we talk about Wisconsin Street Bridge, etc., actually the bridge was, the bridge deck, the top of it, was dry during the September 2008 event. But it's the causeway, which is significantly lower, which forced the closing. And this is a photo. I know it's pretty grainy, but once again, it shows you the extent of the flooding during the September 2008 event and how the inundation pretty much went right up to the bridge deck. So here's a potential solution, okay, at Wisconsin Street. The logical thing to reduce the closure frequency would be to raise the road, right? But by doing that, you know, right now the road is acting like a weir. It's overtopped frequently. If we raise the road now, we're blocking the flow. Okay, so we can't just raise the road because now you're going to increase water surface elevations upstream. You're going to create basically a dam. So if you were to raise the road to keep it, operational during the 100-year event, you would need to reconstruct the bridge that's there to increase the capacity of it. And the bridge that you'd need is about 3 times the length of the existing bridge. That's option 1. Option 2, we look back at 3rd Street and say, okay, if 3rd Street is reconstructed to eliminate the restriction, now we've got lower water surface elevations at Wisconsin Street, and that bridge length can be reduced a little bit more. Option 3, the most prudent thing to do here, is to bundle the 3rd Street and Wisconsin Street projects together, permit them together. And what you're doing there is you can get a bridge span at Wisconsin Street that is only about 140 feet long, which is not much longer than the existing bridge. So with this solution, if 3rd Street and Wisconsin Street are permitted together, you take advantage of the benefits of improving 3rd Street and kind of eat up some of those benefits at Wisconsin Street to have an overall shorter bridge at Wisconsin Street. And with both of those roads being reconstructed, now you've got them elevated to at least a foot above the 100-year flood elevation. If we go downstream, now I'm getting into some of the alternatives that we looked at that really didn't show a lot of benefits. So I will go over them a little bit more quickly. So looking downstream to the Lake Station Dam, here you've got the existing structure. This was during a site visit last summer under a normal flow condition. This photo was taken from approximately the same location just a month later. And what we see here is you've got some really significant tailwater conditions. You've got the water level here quite a bit higher than it was just a month earlier. And what you see is as the flow increases on Deep River, it pretty much drowns out the Lake Station Dam. And the dam's really not doing much. And that kind of, for us, confirmed or explained why this dam is entirely excluded from the effective model, because it's not doing anything for the statistical events, the 10-year, 100-year, etc. But we looked at, what if you were to remove the Lake Station Dam? And also, what if it were replaced with a different dam that was capable of drawing down the upstream water surface to provide additional storage during a flood event? Short story is that neither of those opportunities, neither of those options gave us much for benefits upstream. For one of the events that was modeled, we did bring the water surface down by almost 4 feet, but in this portion of Deep River, the floodplain is extremely narrow, so we weren't actually taking properties out of the floodplain. And the event that that's based on, likelihood of that occurring is not very high. I'm just gonna, if the dam were replaced with some sort of drawdown structure, here the results were about nearly a foot of decrease in the water surface elevation upstream. Again, probably not something that's worth pursuing because it didn't result in removal of any properties from the floodplain. We also looked at a bypass tunnel option, and this would shortcut the flow from Deep River down to Burns Waterway, just west of State Route 51. We looked at 2 options there, one with a single 10-foot diameter tunnel, and then we said, well, what if we tripled it? How much benefit could we get? But with either of those, the benefits were minimal, half a foot at most, in the upstream areas. And we talk about constructability of 3 10-foot tunnels under that developed area, not very good. But even with that half-foot decrease upstream, again, did not result in the removal of any properties from the 100-year floodplain. We also looked at the addition of storage, and 3 primary areas. One we called Rosser Lake Storage, another Indiana, Arizona Storage, and the third one was 37th Avenue Storage.
Wait, can you go back to that map, please?
Yep.
Is there any storage before the start of where you started the project of Deep River study?
Are you talking about upstream? So in this area, Turkey Creek
To
area?
help stop all of the water to get from getting here.
Yep, I will talk about that, yes.
Okay.
Yep. So I guess our approach was to look at, are there locations that are identifiable? Can we add storage in those spots? And for the Rosser Lake Storage area, I'm going to flip back once. We've got a pond here, a lake here, a lake here.
That's over by 65, right?
Yes, it is. Yep. Rosser Lake is about 7 feet higher. The normal water level here is about 7 feet higher than it is right here. So the thought was, what if you did a drawdown of this lake in anticipation of a flood, and then you've got this extra storage.
From where?
By drawing it down. So
No, but
you
where's
create
the
a
water that's
connection.
going to fill up the storage capacity there
Right.
coming from? Not here.
You'd have to create a connection across the railroad here,
Oh.
and then yes, it would come. Yep. But the storage that was added there is about 600 acre feet for the September 2008 event, and it didn't reduce the peak water surface elevations at all. The next area was a little bit further upstream. This is an area that's currently high ground. So in order to construct a storage area right here, you have to do a significant amount of excavation, 3 million cubic yards. And here you're adding a little bit more storage, about 700 acre feet, but still no reductions in the peak water surface elevations. Similar story for that third storage area that was looked at. Here we saw a 1/10 of a foot of reduction. So the question came up, okay, we're adding all this storage, why aren't we seeing the benefits? Or maybe what would it take if you were to construct something upstream? So we played around with that too. And we looked at adding a 100-acre basin upstream of Lake George. And that added about 1,000 acre feet of volume, but it only resulted in 3/10 of a drop in there. And so
We've never studied what happens that way. How do we know that data?
this was by adding a constructed basin. You could say that, you know, what if you were to add 100 basins to come up with the same volume?
You know, I'm from the region, so bear with me, all right? So if you don't know how much hard surface and how much paving has gone on in 30 and Crown Point and all of those areas before it gets to Deep River, and you don't know what that volume is, how can you make the assessment that that's the only benefit you're going to get?
We actually do know what the volume is. If you go back to the hydrograph, that takes into account existing conditions. So all those surfaces are all already.
So everything going through Maryville and Turkey Creek and
Yes,
everything has
it's all-
already been calculated to get us to
Right,
there.
and that's the model. That's when we run this 2008 event. That's the hydrograph we showed. That is the existing conditions, and that's
Okay.
why we use that hydrology, because that accounts for all that stuff.
There's other things that kind of complicate this Lake George drawdown option. The first one being that if you draw the lake down 3 feet, now you only have about 1.5 feet of water depth. The next thing being that there's a lot of retaining walls along the lake. Those would be, could be damaged if the hydrostatic pressure changed significantly like that. We also showed you that hydrograph of the September 2008 event. The lake level was up in just a couple of days. So that may not give enough time to react and implement some sort of plan to draw down the lake. And then the last thing that would make this a complicated thing is that there is a court-established lake level in place, too, based on the dam.
There's a court-established lake level.
Yep, so the lake cannot be intentionally drawn down below this elevation.
So you have to keep the lake level the same even though it floods,
What?
Can't go below 601 point.
right? Even if you get 10 inches of rain? How old is that?
That's as low as the lake.
1964?
Essentially, as I understand it, it was a lawsuit that,
For people that live on the lake.
yeah, to preserve the recreational
Sure.
properties.
In 1964.
Yeah,
But the
and
DNR
it's still old.
did say they were going to pay repair, so it's not.
So this is another episode, you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, and I should clarify that yes, raising the bridges is a solution that we do see providing benefits, not just because now the bridges are going to be higher, it's because by constructing them higher and reducing the restrictions, now you're lowering the water surface elevation upstream. So it's
Moving the water fast.
Yes, yep. Kind of a side note here on sedimentation in Lake George. That bathymetric survey we did was compared to the last dredging effort in 2000, and it showed that 70,000 cubic yards of material has accumulated in the lake in the last 15 years or so. And I know when we started this project, Craig said to me, you got to find a way to get rid of the sediment before it gets to Lake George. And the reality is that Lake George is the sediment basin. Because in order to settle out the fines that are accumulating in the lake, you need a basin the size of Lake George to do it. And we do have some cross sections just to show you the comparison of to show you what is accumulated. We're starting downstream here near the dam, and we've got the recent bathymetric survey and then the old one. And you can see that close to the dam, there's not a lot of accumulation. And keep in mind that the pool down here is relatively small. When we move upstream, you've got larger pools between the bridges. And as you'd expect to see, there's a lot more sediment accumulation upstream. This one's pretty significant too. This is just in this area over here.
It's doing what it's supposed to.
Right. So the thing is, though, that sedimentation is going to continue to occur, and
Acid goes down
Yep.
unless you dredge it all the time.
correct.
Sorry
So
to steal your thunder.
no, it's fine. And there's other things to consider too. Is that the current lake depth is about 4 to 5 feet, and the upstream pools further upstream were not dredged. So I'm going to show you this. These pools here were dredged in 2000. These were not. And if you look at that historical photo over here, you see that this didn't used to be wetland. This used to be lake up here. And that's,
400 permits to do anything with that wetland now.
I know, yeah.
500, yeah. And
Yep.
you'll never be able
It
to,
is.
just so everybody knows, if you're inside of the levee and there's weeds and stuff in there, that's a wetland, you have to get a permit to work on it.
Yes,
Inside the
it
levee.
is absolutely protected, yes. But what I want to show here is that if you do not do any dredging in Lake George, this is the kind of thing you should expect to see happening in the rest of Lake George. The conversion over to wetlands due to the sediment accumulation.
And the last time it was dredged is in 2010,
2000,
2000.
yeah, 15 years ago.
So after all of this, with everybody keep paving, what would the frequency of dredging have to be to increase it? Why don't we go deeper?
Well, I think the idea with the initial dredging
Why not?
was,
Sure.
There's a limit to where
Logic and common
slumping,
sense don't work in this. I
right,
mean,
you buildings on the lake, you start getting deeper, so it starts slumping, so those are the structural things that we can get concerned about when we break the deep. There were pools dredged, there were deeper areas dredged, those were filled in.
yeah.
right.
They created.
So all that green space down there that's now wetlands that I'm sure we'll hear about, we can't dredge that out for capacity.
Right.
Well,
And that,
they did not permit it back then, or try.
and now it is considered environmentally.
Well,
No, I understand. Nothing's easy. We've done already, right?
A couple other things, just looking big picture, could we improve the conveyance of the channel on Deep River to like you said, get the water through faster, reduce the flood elevations? And just looking at a really extreme case to see what the benefits would be, we looked at what if all the trees were cleared along the study reach to reduce the losses. Well, that only resulted in a decrease of 0.8 of a foot for the September 2008 event. And of course, there are other considerations with clearing trees, the environmental aesthetics, etc. So, not something to pursue further. I'm gonna skip over that one. So, this is something that what you're referring to is, the use of some green infrastructure upstream. And when we're talking about green infrastructure, we're talking about things that can provide habitat and flood protection and cleaner water, and act to kind of mimic nature by soaking and storing the water during a flood. These things definitely could be implemented and used together with some of the flood risk management solutions that we're looking at. And one of the really promising things is that when you look at a hydrograph, that significant peak down here, this is a perfect case of where green solutions could really help, because they can hold that water upstream longer and dampen the peak discharge that you'd see on the stream. You have to be careful though with implementing green infrastructure, because it's possible that if the timing's just right, you're actually making things worse by releasing it at the peak time, for example. We also looked at property acquisition and structure elevation, and especially in that lake station area. So things to consider, things to keep on the table probably.
So rather than build a levee, you acquire all property.
Right,
But it provides no significant storage.
right.
So where was the number for that was green solutions, like everything else? Was there an increase or decrease in the amount of storage capacity?
So the green solutions were included as more of a concept because that's something to be included in a hydrologic model.
You know, green solutions are kind of, it's one of those things where, you know, what do you evaluate? The whole watershed implements green solutions, you know, a certain community, so it's really very difficult to quantify. You know, each one you do will help in the upper watershed, but like Rachel said, you have to be careful in the lower watershed because really in this low watershed, you want to get the water out as quick as you can. In the upper watershed, you want to hold it, infiltrate as much as you can.
Well, I thought you told me that didn't make any sense here.
The lower watershed, you want, if you look at the hydrograph, it's very peaky, which means that that's why the water down here, you want to get this out of here before the upper watershed gets here. You don't want to detain it here and then have it coincide with the peak from the upper watershed, or you could make it even worse.
Yeah, like the rain event we just had this past weekend, was all south. Yeah.
And the surge comes. I mean, everywhere going to the river, there's always a surge. If it doesn't rain here and it's raining south in the watershed, it's coming. I mean, I get it.
All right, some things that could be considered with anything that's pursued in the future is the use of FEMA hazard mitigation assistance. There are programs available to provide funding for some of these projects, which would reduce the risk of flooding to property owners and infrastructure. Some of the future steps is that, you know, the model should really be reviewed by the DNR and FEMA. Particularly if we plan to use this model that was created.
But those are the 70s people.
Yep, so we want to give them our updated model so that they start using that as a basis of the future evaluations.